Today, I'm going to tell you the story of how two philosophical giants of the 20th century met one day in 1946 and got into an enormous fight. Ludwig Wittgenstein and Karl Popper didn't like each other. Their personalities clashed. But this was also something more, a fight between two approaches to philosophy, the imperious, impetuous Wittgenstein and the approach that was actually useful, Popper's. Two guys from Vienna, shunted around the world by war, came together in a room in King's College, Cambridge, and they didn't like what they found there. It led, according to eyewitnesses, to the threat of violence with an iron poker. Wittgenstein's story is fabulous. There's wealth, war, power, and tragedy. He was born in 1889 in Vienna. His family was one of the richest in the world. His father, Karl, had stitched up the steel business in Central Europe and retired at age 51. In modern terms, Karl was a billionaire, and the family was famous in turn-of-the-century Vienna for being rich. The Wittgensteins owned property all over the Austro-Hungarian Empire and lived in a palatial mansion in the heart of Vienna. The finest minds in Europe passed through their salon. Vienna was bursting with art, science, and industrial wealth. It was the capital of the empire. No one talks much about Austro-Hungary these days, maybe because it was so short-lived. The empire was born in 1867 and died at the end of World War I just over 50 years later. Strauss, Mahler, Klimt, Mendel, Schrödinger, Adler, Freud, these guys were all citizens. So was Adolf Hitler, born in April 1889 and in the same month as Wittgenstein. And they actually attended the same high school. There are no other important similarities or parallels, except maybe to point out that Hitler would become obsessed with wiping out exactly what Wittgenstein was, a hyper-wealthy, hyper-smart man of Jewish descent. Ludwig Wittgenstein was the last of 8 children. This was a brilliant but troubled family, dogged by death and misfortune. 3 of Wittgenstein's 5 brothers committed suicide. His remaining brother lost an arm in the war, and 2 of his sisters had to spend most of the family fortune to avoid being exterminated by the Nazis. Wittgenstein, the youngest child, was fascinated by engineering until, studying in England, in Manchester actually, he came across the logical philosophy of Bertrand Russell. Anyone who met Wittgenstein at any point during his life was impressed by his intelligence and energy. There was a philosophical arrogance about him that manifested in his first publication, the English version of which had a Latin name, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. Wittgenstein wrote it in German in the trenches of the Eastern Front in the First World War. He was fighting for Austria. Wittgenstein declared that with his Tractatus, he had done away with most of philosophy's ancient problems because he had logically shown what could meaningfully be discussed and what could not. Most of philosophy was meaningless. Having dusted that off, he gave away his entire fortune, his share of the family money, and became a school teacher. He was inspiring to some, but he was also difficult, irritable, and violent. He actually knocked a kid out when he was hitting him, which led to a court case and his dismissal. Meanwhile, Wittgenstein's old schoolmate Hitler, burning with the humiliation of defeat in World War I, was gaining ground in Germany and eventually came to power. Hitler united Germany and Austria and set about his campaign of destroying the Jews. Wittgenstein had to stay away. He gained UK citizenship, became head of philosophy at Cambridge, and then worked through the Second World War as a hospital orderly and lab technician. After the war, he resumed at Cambridge, where he was to meet Popper in person for the first and only time. The Poppers and the Wittgensteins were superficially similar, both quintessentially Viennese, the product of empire. Both assimilated Jewish families, recent converts to Christianity, but where the Wittgensteins were famous and rich, the Poppers were respectable and merely well off. Karl Popper was born in 1902, 13 years after Wittgenstein. His father was a lawyer. Popper, unlike Wittgenstein, never fought in a war, and he wasn't a man of action. When he was dirt poor, he tried road mending, but he was too physically weak for the job. Popper was extremely concerned with the practical implications of ways of thinking. While Wittgenstein is a hero to many in the arts and academia, a kind of mythical figure, Popper is more influential in science and politics. Popper's outlook and thinking was influenced by the times and his experience of them. His father lost all the family money when Austria's economy tanked at the end of the First World War. Popper became a teacher just like Wittgenstein, but unlike Wittgenstein, he had to survive. On the streets of Vienna, Popper saw firsthand how both communism and fascism led to violence. He saw how visions of utopia could be used to justify anything. His life was shaped by totalitarian movements, first when he had to leave Austria in 1937 because of the Nazis, and then after the Second World War by the prolonged conflict between communist USSR and the West. During the Second World War, Popper wrote The Open Society and Its Enemies, an explanation for totalitarianism that traces its roots to Plato and the search for perfection. He wrote the book in New Zealand, where he lived out the war. In the book, he takes several potshots at Wittgenstein and how wrong he was. At the end of the war, Popper landed a job in London, and Wittgenstein resumed his role as head of philosophy at Cambridge. Wittgenstein had built up a group of passionate academic admirers who went so far as to dress the same way as him, kind of like philosophy Swifties. The Wittkis believed the most important problems of philosophy were problems of language, and that language, therefore, was what philosophers should study. Wittgenstein wrote, "Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language." You can see how enticing this view is. It does sound right, doesn't it? Because what philosophers do is play with words. They don't go looking for evidence in the world. Isn't the whole thing just a bewitchment of the intelligence? But Popper wasn't having a bar of that. He thought Wittgenstein exaggerated. Just because some philosophical problems are playing with words doesn't mean that all are. He believed that the business of any thinker and the business of life was to solve problems. If you don't believe there are any real philosophical problems, then you should give up philosophy. Wittgenstein was the head of philosophy at one of the world's most elite universities, and he had basically said it was all rubbish. In terms of personality, both Popper and Wittgenstein could be utterly unpleasant. Both were argumentative and didn't understand the socially acceptable limits of disagreement. In Popper's case, he might apologise after taking things too far, but Wittgenstein just didn't care. The extreme wealth, privilege and cruel rigour of his upbringing, combined with his obsessive personality, meant that the rules of normal politeness just didn't apply to him. Both men were accustomed to being the most dominant voice in the room. Actually, they were intellectual bullies. And what happens when two bullies meet? The clash between these two philosophy heavyweights took place in October 1946. The war was just over, the tatty blackout curtains still hanging in the rooms in King's College, where the Moral Sciences Club met. A coal fire was burning in the grate. These were the days before central heating or the climate crisis. Popper stood to read his paper. Are there philosophical problems? It was a direct, carefully planned attack on Wittgenstein's entire philosophy, the idea that the big questions are nothing more than tangles of words. He didn't get far before Wittgenstein interrupted, and so it began. These two men, accustomed to being the smartest guy in the room, used words to attack. Words, the things they had spent their lives honing, the things they were talking about, turning in on themselves. Their voices were loud and unpleasant. The Wittkis packing the room egged on their leader, while Bertrand Russell, the elder statesman and legend of logical method, intervened to support Popper once. Wittgenstein picked up the poker that had been used to prod the coals and began waving it around in front of Popper, making his points. In his thinking, this horrible little man from Vienna, an ass he would later describe Popper as, was getting it all wrong. He was a fly trapped in a bottle of words. Popper, for his part, by nature and experience, never backed down. He was always the outsider, the one who didn't quite fit, and he was proud of that. But at the same time, he craved recognition. He wouldn't be happy until Wittgenstein admitted defeat. That wasn't going to happen. The poker was grasped, thrust, waved about. Wittgenstein, perhaps realising he'd gone too far, threw it down and strode out of the room, slamming the door. None of this was unusual. He never left a room quietly. But Popper had never met the man before and would never meet him again. Who won? As with much of philosophy, it depends on which argument you believe to begin with. For someone not concerned with status, This clash of alpha thinkers was like watching two worlds collide. Wittgenstein, the brilliant Wittgenstein, with his sweeping intuitive claims, his paragraphs ring like crystal bells. But are they actually true, rather than just brilliant? What was Wittgenstein's system? What overall point was he making? There's an element of faith you need to follow Wittgenstein, to follow that spark of genius. That's not the case with Popper. Read The Open Society and you'll see what I mean. You can understand every word, every sentence, and he builds a case. He savages Plato, Hegel, and Marx. Some of it is excessive, but I enjoy it. And when he comes to his conclusion that it is the search for the ideal originating in the worldview of perfect forms that leads to so much violence and suffering, you believe him. This is philosophy you can understand. After their shouting match, when Wittgenstein had left the room, one of the Wittgenstein fans challenged Popper for an example of a moral rule. Popper replied, not to threaten visiting lecturers with pokers. Much of the information in this video was gleaned from the book Wittgenstein's Poker by David Edmonds and John Edenau. I recommend it. Thanks for listening. My name is Hal Crawford and this is What If When.